On nights like this, Riverton never felt safe, though most of its residents never realized it. To them, it was a sleepy coastal town where nothing much changed, a wind-battered place where people locked their doors more against the storm than against crime. But John Miller knew better. He'd seen how quickly shadows could hide danger, how easily trouble could sneak into the quietest corners. And tonight, beneath a bloated sky swollen with storm clouds, he and his loyal partner Shadow would stumble into something that would change both their lives forever. The old town seemed to hold its breath as the Atlantic winds rattled against the seawall. The street lamps bent under the gusts, their weak glow smeared by drifting mist. Waves smashed restlessly against stone, sending fine spray into the air that coated everything in a salty sheen. Most people had long retreated indoors, shutters closed, fires warming their rooms. What unfolded here tonight was not meant for ordinary eyes. Officer John Miller guided his patrol car carefully along the slick shoreline road. He was methodical, a man shaped by years of duty, his every movement steady, deliberate. At 36, time and hardship had etched themselves into his face. His broad frame filled the Navy uniform with ease, but it was his eyes that spoke most of him. Storm gray, thoughtful, carrying quiet burdens, eyes that witnessed cruelty, resilience, and redemption, yet still refused to go cold. Behind the uniform was a man marked by sadness. His wife Caroline lost to illness years before. That grief reshaped him into someone quieter, slower to speak, but heavier with meaning when he did. His world was now anchored by Shadow, the 6-year-old German, shepherd in the passenger seat. Shadow's muscled frame and alert ears made him a fearsome working dog. But to John, he was more than a police partner. He was family. The kind of family who could be trusted to run toward danger without hesitation. John had seen his dog wrench him out of death's path more than once, and their bond was stitched together by something deeper than simple training. Tonight, the dog seemed restless, amber eyes scanning the fog-draped horizon as if he could already sense what lay ahead. The patrol had been expected to be uneventful, just routine sweeps of shops and the darkened waterfront. But then something shifted. Shadow stiffened, ears pricking forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, until it burst into sharp barks that ripped through the damp night. John's eyes followed, focusing on a sight that immediately set his instincts on edge. There, half hidden by fog and shadow, sat a glossy black Mercedes. Its polished surface reflected thin slashes of light from the lamps, making it seem gleaming and ghostly all at once. John slowed the patrol car. The sleek foreign vehicle looked wrong here, too flashy for Riverton's working harbor district. More than that, the two men standing beside it ignited suspicion instantly. Fog curled around them like cigarette smoke, which in fact drifted casually from their hands. Yet John noticed what casual eyes would never: the tension underneath. The taller of the two leaned with forced ease against the Mercedes, leather jacket slung loose, his face sharp-boned, unshaven, hardened. His companion, younger and wirier, hid beneath a low-brimmed baseball cap, shifting uneasily like his legs couldn't bear to stay still. Together, their silence was louder than their murmured words. They weren't waiting for a friend. They were hiding something. John rolled closer, headlights slicing the night. Shadow, hackles rising, let out a short command-like bark that locked onto the car itself, particularly its trunk. Miller, calm but fully alert now, stopped a few yards away and stepped out. The Atlantic wind whipped salt against his face as he adjusted his belt, hand hovering by instinct near his holstered weapon. "Evening," he called, voice firm but not aggressive, a tone that carried authority like weight on the air. "Everything all right here?" The taller man flicked away his cigarette, his smile appearing too quickly, too easily. "Just stretching our legs, officer. Nothing illegal about that, eh?" His voice rolled smooth and gritty, the kind used by men who lie for a living. John, Let silence answer first. He studied them, eyes narrowing, grip steady. The younger one kept flicking nervous side glances toward the patrol car but more often toward their own Mercedes. Shadow, too, was studying, chest heaving, body still as iron except for the tension rippling beneath his coat. Moments stretched. Then the taller man took a half-step forward, feigning calm but radiating nerves. "We're moving along now. No problem here." And then, Shadow broke the illusion. A thunder-crack bark tore the silence, his entire body snapping its attention toward the Mercedes's rear trunk. The dog knew. Miller's eyes followed instantly, his suspicion crystallizing. The younger man muttered a curse under his breath, eyes wide. "We're done. Let's go." His partner snarled back at him, but it was already too late. The act was finished. Both men scrambled inside the sedan. Tires screeched, fog splitting apart as the engine roared them away. For one brief instant, all Pastor Miller saw were glowing red tail lights glowing against the mist. John's calm cracked into action. He slid into the patrol car, siren blaring, salt-colored light bursting over the seawall like fractured lightning. "Hang on, boy," he muttered. Shadow leapt instantly into position, braced against the seat, barking with urgent fury as the chase surged forward. The road twisted with coastal grass and metal warning signs bent by years of storms. John pushed, the car harder, steady hands on the wheel, Shadow growling encouragement beside him. The Mercedes hurtled ahead, its erratic path betraying its driver's panic. Inside that fleeing car, Ray Marcado, barely 25 and already drowning in bad choices, fought his own nerve. His thin hands strangled the steering wheel, sweat damp on his forehead. "I told you that dog would ruin everything," he hissed desperately. Beside him sat Vince Lang. Older, rougher, scar across his cheek like a permanent warning to the world, Vince had lived through enough fights and failures to know danger when it came. But even his steady glare couldn't slow Ray's panic as the patrol car closed the gap. "Shut up and drive," Vince barked. "We drop this ride near the old pier and vanish." But panic had already stolen Ray's composure. Ahead, the road, bent hard, too sharp, too soon. His desperate hands pulled wrong, and with a scream of tires and metal, the Mercedes spun wildly. It slammed into a concrete marker, steel twisting, headlights exploding like shattered glass. The car groaned against itself, steaming and broken, illumination flickering weakly through the fog. Vince pushed his door open with brute force, dragging Ray like a ragged child. "Run!" he snarled, and together they bolted into the dunes. John skidded to a halt behind them, every sense heightened. One hand brushed his weapon. But he wasn't watching the men now. Shadow was already gone, his muscular form sprinting. Not after the fugitives, but circling with pointed certainty around the back of the crumpled black Mercedes. But circling the rear of the wrecked car, with urgency. He barked again, fierce, loud, and insistent. "Shadow!" John called, gun still drawn. The dog's body language changed. He stopped barking and pressed his nose to the trunk of the Mercedes. His tail lowered, and a low whine escaped his throat, alert, but not aggressive. It was the sound Shadow made when he found something or someone. John holstered his weapon and stepped closer. The smell of burnt rubber and coolant filled the air. The trunk was dented but intact, the lock still functional. His breath caught in his chest as he reached for it. With a sharp motion, John popped the trunk. Inside, curled on her side and bound at the wrists and ankles, lay a young woman. Her long chestnut hair was tangled and matted against her cheek, her skin pale and bruised. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth and her eyes wide, frightened, and shimmering with tears locked onto Jay's. As the light hit her face, Shadow let out a low whine again, inching closer. John leaned in. "It's okay, you're safe now." He carefully peeled the tape from her mouth as she gasped, trying to speak through shock and exhaustion. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, and her breath came in short bursts. "Help! Please! I've got you!" John said, cutting through the ropes with the utility blade on his belt. He lifted her gently out of the trunk, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. She was trembling, her body cold from exposure and fear. As he guided her to the patrol car, he finally asked, "What's your name?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Sophia. Sophia Turner." The name hit him like a wave. He had heard it before on the news in briefings. Sophia Turner, the 23-year-old daughter of Charles Turner, a billionaire industrialist whose influence extended from Wall Street to the governor's office. She had disappeared 4 days ago in Boston, a kidnapping case that had gripped the state. "You're the missing heiress," John breathed. She nodded weakly. "They were going to kill me." Shadow stayed close as if sensing her fragility, his amber eyes watching both her and the darkness around them. John called for backup immediately. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need EMS and backup to my location. I've located Sophia Turner." Repeat, Sophia Turner, injured but alive. 2 suspects fled on foot, last seen heading northbound into the dunes near mile marker 14. The voice on the other end crackled in with disbelief. "Copy that, Unit 7. We're sending units now. Stand by." John helped Sophia into the back seat of the patrol car, covering her with a thermal blanket from the emergency kit. She winced with every movement. "They kept me in different places," she murmured. "I don't know where they moved me. Said my father would pay or they'd make sure I vanished." "You don't need to say anything more right now," John reassured her. "You're safe. You're going home." Shadow sat just outside the door, still alert, head tilted slightly. Sophia reached out a trembling hand and touched his head. Shadow leaned into the touch. "He found me," she said, eyes wet with relief. John looked at Shadow, pride swelling in his chest. "Yeah, he always does." As the first flashing lights of backup units appeared through the fog, John finally allowed himself to breathe. Sophia Turner was alive, and it was Shadow who had made sure of that. The small coastal police station in Fairpoint, Maine, buzzed with subdued urgency as the night deepened. A storm had begun to roll in from the Atlantic, casting streaks of lightning across the glass windows of the briefing room. Officer John Miller walked in, drenched from the rain, his expression hard but composed. At his side, Shadow, the 9-year-old German shepherd, shook the water off his thick sable and silver coat, then calmly took a seat near the door, his ears alert, his eyes never leaving the girl in the corner. Sophia Turner sat hunched beneath a gray station-issued blanket. Her long hair was damp, her face pale, but her gaze had hardened since the moment she'd been pulled from the trunk. She sat beside a cup of untouched tea, her trembling fingers playing with the frayed edge of the blanket. There was an elegance in her features, a natural grace inherited from a life of privilege, but the bruises on her cheekbone and the swelling on her lip painted a different story, one of captivity, one of betrayal. Detective Marcy H. Holstead stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. In her late 40s, Marcy was tall and broad-shouldered with peppered auburn hair tied back in a low ponytail. Years in major crimes had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze was sharp and no nonsense. A single mother who had risen through the ranks, she had little patience for games, and even less for the media circus that would erupt once the name Turner hit the press. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from Sophia. "Miss Turner," Marcy began, her voice even, "we know you've been through a lot. We need to understand everything you can remember. Anything at all could help us stop the men who did this." Sophia took a deep breath and glanced at Shadow. The dog was now lying at her feet, head resting near her boot, his presence surprisingly calming. She reached down and brushed her fingers gently against his fur. "He hasn't left my side since I got here," she whispered. "Thank you, both of you." John, standing behind Marcy, nodded slightly. Just take your time. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, gathering her thoughts. Then she began. I was taken 4 nights ago. I was at a fundraiser in downtown Boston, an event for children's cancer research. My father had to fly to D.C. for meetings, so I went alone. I left around 10 Tikao. There was a car waiting for me. I assumed it was one of my father's drivers. Her voice caught. She looked down. It wasn't. Marcy's pen scratched gently on a notepad. You were forced in? Sophia nodded. 2 men. They covered my face. I think they injected me with something. I blacked out. I woke up in a warehouse. Then later, in what I think was a basement, they kept moving me. John stepped forward. Did they ever mention names? Places? Sophia hesitated. No places. But they mentioned someone named Vincent. Vincent Kane. The room seemed to go still. Marcy glanced at John. John said the name aloud quietly. Vincent Kane. Sophia looked up. You know him? John nodded grimly. Everyone in law enforcement knows Vincent Kane. He's a businessman on paper, but behind that smile is a snake. Arms trafficking, corporate blackmail, racketeering, you name it. But he always covers his tracks. We've never been able to pin anything to him directly, Marcy added. And now he's made a move against your father. Sophia's eyes filled with tears again. They wanted to use me to destroy him. They said my father had crossed lines he wasn't supposed to, that it was time he paid. Marcy leaned forward. And you believe Kane orchestrated the kidnapping? Sophia nodded. Yes. I heard them mention him multiple times, and they said something about sending a message that letting me go wasn't part of the plan. John exhaled slowly, the picture becoming clearer. This wasn't a random abduction. This was strategic. A move on a high-stakes board. Shadow suddenly lifted his head and gave a low growl, not aggressive, but cautious. The door behind them creaked, open as Deputy Evan Rodas walked in. In his early 30s, Evan had a kind, boyish face with curly blonde hair and a nervous energy that rarely matched the chaos of his job. He carried a clipboard and gave a half-apologetic smile. Sorry to interrupt, he said, looking at John. The press is starting to swarm outside, and we've got an incoming call from Charles Turner. John turned to Sophia. Do you want to speak to your father? Sophia hesitated. Her lips trembled for a moment before she gave a shaky nod. I think I need to. They moved her to a private office. Shadow followed closely, refusing to be left behind. When the call connected, the speakerphone filled with a gravel-rich voice that cracked with emotion. Sophia, the man said. Sweetheart, is that you? Tears streamed down her cheeks. Dad. Charles Turner, though not seen in person yet, carried the weight of power in every word. He sounded like a man used to controlling outcomes, but now that control was gone. The relief in his voice was palpable. He promised the full strength of his legal team, his security force, even his private investigators. But John had seen what men like Vincent Kane were capable of, and he knew one thing. This wasn't over. When Sophia ended the call, her eyes met John's again. They won't stop, will they? No, he said honestly. But neither will we. As she leaned back, Shadow rested his head on her lap. It was the first time she had smiled in days. The morning after the rescue brought no peace. In a glass tower overlooking Boston Harbor, Vincent Kane stared silently out the window as fog curled along the water's edge. His sharp jaw clenched, his manicured fingers tightening around a crystal glass of scotch that remained untouched. He was Ammon in his late 50s, tall, lean, always dressed with precision today, in a black three-piece suit that matched the void in his chest. His eyes, a chilling shade of icy gray, were filled not with panic, but calculation. The news had reached him just hours ago. Sophia Turner was alive, and worse, she had spoken. Find out who the cop is, he said calmly, placing the glass down without a sound. And the dog. I want them erased. Across the room stood Rico Valls, Vincent's most trusted enforcer, mid-40s, stocky and rugged, with scars on both hands and a stare that unsettled most men. He was a man of few words and absolute loyalty. He gave a silent nod and turned on his heel, phone already buzzing in his hand. Vincent moved to a leather chair, sat down slowly, and steepled his fingers. She was supposed to disappear, he muttered to himself. And now this John Miller. He spoke the name like poison. Back in Fairpoint, Officer John Miller sat alone in his small apartment above the police station. He sipped stale coffee and stared at the window where rain tapped softly. Shadow lay curled on the rug, his eyes barely open but ears always alert. John's mind was a cyclone. He had seen this kind of heat before during his time as a federal task force officer in New Jersey. But something about Vincent Kane was colder, older, more calculating. This wasn't just revenge, this was strategy. This was message sending. A knock at the door broke the silence. John stood, his hand instinctively brushing the holster at his hip before opening the door. On the other side stood Chief Marin Bridges, a wiry man in his 60s with a permanent squint and a draw that lingered even after 2 decades in Maine. His uniform was pressed, but the man himself had the weathered look of someone who had seen far, too many storms, literal and otherwise. "You're a marked man now, son," Marlin said simply. "They're not going to let this go." "I know," John replied. "That's why I need to move her." Chief Bridges walked in, glanced at Shadow, whom he respected deeply, and lowered his voice. "Kane's got eyes everywhere. We're a small station. We can't hold off a full strike. Then we get ahead of it." Later that day, Sophia was moved to a safe house. It wasn't glamorous, just a cabin outside town owned by an old retired sheriff who now spent most of his days fishing in Florida. Shadow rode in the back seat with Sophia, his muzzle resting on the edge of the seat. She stroked the fur between his ears, her eyes still rimmed with tiredness, but no longer filled with panic. "I don't think I ever said thank you," she whispered to the dog. Shadow blinked slowly, then nudged her arm with his nose. John drove in silence. His jaw was tight, his mind always ticking. But behind that hardened exterior, something stirred. A protective instinct that went deeper than duty. He didn't know why yet, but something about Sophia Turner reminded him of someone he had failed long ago. Back in Boston, Rico delivered the intel. John Miller, ex-federal, moved to Fairpoint after a suspension. Decorated K-9 handler. The dog Shadow is retired K-9, age 9, trained in search, tracking, and defense. Vincent read the file without flinching, then looked up. "Kill the dog first." Rico raised an eyebrow. Vincent leaned forward. "You kill a man's dog, and you kill his soul. The man follows." That night, under the cover of fog, 2 figures crept through the forest surrounding the safe house. Both wore black, their footsteps muffled by damp leaves. One carried a suppressed weapon, the other a small drone used for heat detection. But Shadow had already woken. From his post by the fireplace, his ears perked up. He rose silently and walked to the back door, his body tense. A low growl formed in his throat. John, who hadn't slept, was already moving, gun, body lowered. Sophia sat up from the couch where she had been trying to rest. "What is it?" "Trouble," John murmured. "Stay down. Stay quiet." Outside, one of the intruders paused, spotting heat signatures. 3 bodies, 2 upright, 1 lower. The man raised his hand in signal, but then a blur of motion. Shadow shot through the back door, silent as wind, barreling into the man with the drone. The attacker screamed as sharp teeth sank into his arm. His partner raised his gun, but a single shot from John dropped him before he could pull the trigger. The other man tried to flee. Shadow still clamped on his forearm. Another warning shot cracked the air. He dropped to the ground, screaming, begging the dog to let go. John approached, panting, his weapon trained. "You picked the wrong dog," he said coldly. Hours later, the two men were in custody. Sophia sat beside Shadow, her hand trembling as she sheathed him small pieces of jerky from her pocket. He deserved a steak, but it was all she had. "Will they come again?" she asked. John nodded. "Yes. And will we be ready?" He looked at her then, not just as a victim, but as someone who had survived. "Irai, we will." Outside the Fairpoint Police Station, black sedans lined the curb like armored beetles. Their tinted windows reflected the pale gray sky, and the sharp scent of rain hung in the air, clinging to the concrete-like tension in a courtroom. The town, normally so quiet, stirred with unease. Inside, Officer John Miller stood in his uniform, near the entrance, his posture straight, his eyes calm but watchful. Beside him sat Shadow, the 9-year-old German shepherd with black and sable fur now flecked with traces of dust and dried salt. Shadow's tail rested motionless against the floor, but his ears twitched occasionally. He was always listening. Then the door opened. Two men in expensive coats entered first, one tall and pale with a clipboard, the other short and stocky with an earpiece. Their eyes scanned the room professionally, cold and unblinking. Following them was a figure who did not need an introduction. Richard Turner. He was in his early 60s, but age had only refined him, not softened him. Silver hair combed back neatly, skin bronzed from years of golf courses and overseas boardrooms. He wore a dark navy trench coat over a tailored suit and walked with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto John before the pleasantries even began. "You must be the officer who found my daughter," he said without offering a hand. John gave a nod. "Sir, I'm Officer Miller, and this is Shadow." Richard's gaze flicked briefly to the dog, then back to John. "She's safe. She's resting in the back, but shaken. It wasn't just a kidnapping attempt, it was a message. You have enemies, Mr. Turner." Richard's face tightened for a heartbeat, then relaxed into something cooler, almost indifferent. "I have competitors, officer, not enemies. That's the language of drama, not business." Behind them, a door creaked. Sophia appeared. She was dressed simply in jeans and a soft gray sweater borrowed from the station locker. Her dark hair, usually impeccably styled, was tied back in a loose ponytail. Her eyes, still swollen from sleepless nights, narrowed as they fell on her father. "Nice of you to finally show up," she said, her voice brittle. Richard took a step toward her, arms slightly raised, but stopped short as if remembering this wasn't a boardroom negotiation. "Sophia," he began, his voice measured. "I flew the moment I got the call." "But you didn't call me once before that," she interrupted, tone sharp. "Not on my birthday. Not when I moved out. Not even when I started working at your competitor's charity program. You sent a lawyer instead." There was silence. Shadow walked to Sophia's side and pressed his head gently against her hip. She laid a hand on his head without looking down, drawing strength from the silent sentinel beside her. John took a step back, giving them space. Richard folded his arms, and for a moment his cool veneer faltered. "You know I don't do emotions well. Maybe you should have learned," she snapped, eyes glinting with unshed tears. "Because while you were busy being a titan of industry, I was in the trunk of a car, praying I wouldn't be thrown into the ocean." A long silence passed. Then Sophia sighed, her voice quieter. "I'm not asking you to change. I just want to understand why. Why it always felt like I was just another asset in your portfolio." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, a slow, broken thing. For a man who had never apologized, it was the closest thing to surrender. John stood just outside the room with Chief Marin Bridges, who leaned slightly against the wall, arms crossed. That your dog sniffed her out before we even knew something was wrong, the chief said, shaking his head. I've seen good kinds, but Shadow, that's something else. John gave a quiet smile. He listens with more than his ears. They watched as Sophia sat down Richard across from her now. The room was still but not cold. There was an invisible thread between them, fragile but not broken. Then Richard leaned forward. There's something you don't know, he said to his daughter. Something I've kept from you. About your mother? About Vincent Kane? Sophia's brow furrowed. What does he have to do with Mom? But Richard shook his head. Not now. Not here. But you deserve the truth. Later, Richard approached John privately in the hallway. This time, his voice held a weight it hadn't before. I owe you my daughter's life, he said simply. Name your price. John blinked. Excuse me. I'm not offering a bribe. I'm offering you a future. I own 7 companies with private security. Branches. You could command any unit. You and your dog John's answer was firm. I don't save people for favors, Mr. Turner. I do it because I believe some people are still worth saving. Richard studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod of respect, the first honest one of the day. That evening, as the rain began again, John sat alone in the break room. Shadow was sprawled near the heater, his breathing soft and steady. Sophia walked in quietly. He offered you a job, didn't he? She asked. John nodded. He did, and you said no. I did. She hesitated, then looked down at Shadow. Do you ever wish you could just disappear? Find a beach. No chaos, just peace. John tilted his head, thinking, I think peace is earned, not found. And if we ever do get to a beach, Shadow will probably just dig holes in the sand looking for bad guys. Sophia laughed. For the first time in days, it was real. The salt-laced wind blew colder than usual that morning. The waterfront in Fairpoint had always had a certain desolate charmwood piers, creaking under the weight of time, fog rolling in from the bay like a slow whisper. But this morning there was something sharper in the air, something waiting to break. John Miller stood beside his cruiser, parked near Pier 9. His eyes narrowed at the line of warehouses that hugged the edge of the dock. His gloved hand rested on Shadow's collar. The dog, lean and alert, stood poised like a coiled spring, nose twitching, eyes locked ahead. They're here, John muttered. For the past 48 hours, intel from a street informant, a twitchy mechanic named Benny Cray, had hinted at movement down at the docks. Benny, a thin man with sunken cheeks, greasy hair, and a nervous stutter, had shown up at the station 2 nights ago, smelling of engine oil and fear. I saw Kane's guys, Benny had said, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 black SUVs, warehouse 42. They're unloading something or someone. And now here John was. He motioned for Shadow to stay low. The German shepherd obeyed instantly, moving beside, crates and oil drums with fluid silence. They approached a side entrance of the warehouse. Just then, the unmistakable sound of muffled voices filtered through the corrugated metal walls. Then the slam of a van door. John peeked around the corner. 3 men, one holding an AR-15, one smoking, the last leaning into the back of a black van parked at the dock's edge. Inside the van he glimpsed black duffel bags, heavy ones, drugs, weapons. It didn't matter. What mattered was that these men were nother for business. They were here for war. Suddenly, Shadow let out a low growl. One of the men turned. Hey, you hear that? John had no time to hesitate. Police, drop your weapons. But they didn't. Instead, chaos broke loose. Bullets tore through the air as one of the men swung his rifle toward John. John dove behind a steel container, drawing his sidearm and returning fire. Shadow bolted across the open space, circling wide to flank the men. He knew these movements like instinct because they were. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Turner was attempting to quietly relocate his daughter. They were seated in the back of a sleek, bulletproof town car. Richard sat stiffly, arms folded. Sophia sat beside him, arms wrapped tightly around herself, glancing nervously out the window every few seconds. "I don't like this," she murmured. "We're taking precautions," her father replied, tone clipped. "The house in Edgewater is guarded. You'll be safe. I don't want to hide. I want to fight." Richard glanced at her, then really looked at her. She was no longer the spoiled girl who complained about press appearances. There was something different in her now. A spark, a steel edge, and perhaps guilt clawed at him, knowing he had never nurtured that spark, just neglected it until it grew wild. Suddenly the driver's voice came over the intercom. "Sir, we're being followed." "What?" "Black sedan been tailing us since 11th in Ash." Sophia's heart dropped. "They found us." Back at the docks, John's clip ran dry. He ducked low behind the crate as two more shots hit the wall inches from his head. One of the men had climbed onto the stacked barrels to get a better shot. John cursed under his breath, but before he could reload, a scream pierced the air. One of the gunmen was down, his forearm bleeding profusely. Shadow had leapt onto him from the blind side, teeth clamped deep into the man's shooting arm. The rifle dropped with a thud. Another thug turned, yelling, "Get that dog!" But it was too late. John was up again, gun steady. "Drop it now or you're next." The remaining men froze. One dropped his pistol. The other took a shaky step back and tried to run, only to be met by the blue and red lights of arriving backup units, sirens slicing through the tension like a blade. John ran to Shadow, kneeling beside him. "You all right, buddy?" Shadow wed softly but licked John's glove, tail wagging weakly. In the meantime, Richard's car had pulled off into a loading zone near an old marina warehouse to escape the pursuers. The black sedan stopped behind them. Two men stepped out. One was tall, wearing a ball cap, sunglasses, and leather gloves. The other was lean and wiry, dragging a long chain from his coat. Sophia's breath caught. "They're not here to intimidate," she whispered. "They're here to take us." Richard reached for the emergency pistol compartment, but before he could pull a trigger, a familiar growl echoed from nearby. Shadow. And behind him, John. Richard stared in disbelief as John and Shadow charged from the side alley. A firefight erupted. The first thug fired twice before Shadow was on him. The second thug turned to shoot at John, but Richard, for the first time in his life, aimed and fired clean. The man crumpled. After the smoke cleared, Sophia rushed out of the car. Shadow was standing over one of the attackers, panting but unharmed. His eyes remained focused on the downed man, refusing to move until John gave the release word. "Good boy," John said softly. Richard approached them, shaken but composed. He looked at Shadow with new eyes, eyes that now saw not just a trained animal, but a protector, a soul. "That dog," he said quietly, "just saved my family." John nodded. "He's done it before. He'll do it again." Richard turned to John, offering his hand. This time, not as a businessman, but as a father. "Thank you." John accepted the handshake but didn't say anything. He just looked at Sophia, who was already down on one knee beside Shadow, arms around his thick neck. "I think he likes you more than me, John," Sophia smiled. "That makes two of us." The sky over Ocean View darkened with storm clouds rolling in from the east, a brooding prelude to the storm brewing in the heart of the city. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air was thick with electricity. Tension seemed to vibrate in every corner of the police precinct as word spread. Vincent Kane had stepped out of the shadows. Kane was no longer hiding behind layers of criminal hierarchy. The ruthless mastermind, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, slicked-back hair and eyes like obsidian, had decided to take matters into his own hands. Known for his signature charcoal suits and cold detachment, Vincent wasn't one to get his hands dirty. But tonight was different. His empire had been wounded first by a runaway girl, then by a local cop and his dog. John Miller stood by the precinct's armored vehicle, Shadow at his side. The German shepherd's ears were upright, his body tense. Now nearly 9 years old, Shadow was a seasoned K9, lean, but muscular, his fur a striking mix of sable and tan. He had earned the respect of the entire department, not only for his discipline, but for the instinctual bond he shared with John. Sophia Turner was safely housed in a secure location, or so they thought. She had been moved to a temporary safe house on the outskirts of town under the watch of 2 officers from the elite detail, but Kane was always a step ahead. At 9:43 p.m., dispatch came through. Shots fired near the marina warehouses. One of the officers assigned to Sophia was down. The second was unresponsive. John's heart dropped. He grabbed his gear and rushed for the cruiser, Shadow leaping in beside him without command. Richard Turner, Sophia's father, had not returned to New York. He had stayed back, haunted by the distance he had long kept between him and his daughter. A tall man with a commanding presence, silver. Gray hair always combed immaculately and dressed in tailored Navy suits even during crisis, Richard was pride incarnate. But the events of the past days had carved worry into his brows. When he learned of the attack, Richard demanded to go. John resisted at first, but seeing the desperation in the father's eyes, he reluctantly agreed with one condition. Richard would wear a vest and stay behind the team. The warehouse district at the marina was demand maze-like, lit only by flickering security lights. Vincent's men were everywhere on rooftops in alleys, some posing as dock workers. They weren't hiding anymore. This was war. A bullet shattered the rear window of John's cruiser just as they arrived. Shadow barked wildly. John rolled out behind a dumpster and returned fire. 2 patrol cars screeched behind them, officers taking position. Through the crackling of radios and yelling of orders, Jay's voice rang out. Shadow search. The dog dashed into the shadows like a phantom, ducking between crates and broken machinery. Within minutes, a muffled scream echoed through the warehouse. Sophia had been found. She was being dragged by a masked man toward a black van. Her wrists were bound again, though not tightly, and her mouth was gagged. Panic widened her eyes, but when she saw a shadow sprinting toward her, hope flickered like a match in a windstorm. The man raised his gun, but too late. Shadow lunged, teeth clamping down on the assailant's wrist with such force that the weapon fell. John Wassa Khan's behind, tackling the man to the ground. 2 other officers secured Sophia. But the fight wasn't over. From the shadows stepped Vincent Kane himself. No mask, no disguise, just pure venom in his stare. He pointed a silver pistol directly at John. I told them not to underestimate you, Kane said, voice calm. But no one listens until the Empire bleeds. Drop the weapon, John warned, gun drawn. But before either could fire, another shot rang out, this one from the side. Richard Turner, standing 10 ft away with trembling hands, had pulled the trigger. The bullet grazed Vincent's shoulder, sending him staggering backward. It was not fatal, but it was enough. Shadow seized the moment, rushing in with the force of a freight train. The dog knocked Vincent to the ground, teeth flashing inches from his face as John moved to restrain him. Backup arrived seconds later. Vincent Kane was arrested, wounded, and stunned. As he was dragged away, his eyes met Sophia's, but not with fear, with hatred. Richard rushed to his daughter, dropping the gun. I should have been there sooner, he said, voice cracking for the first time. Sophia, shaken and bruised but alive, leaned into his embrace. You're here now, she whispered. And in that moment, father and daughter found something they hadn't known they'd lost. A bond deeper than wealth, beyond power. Shadow limped slightly. One of Vincent's men had managed to nick his shoulder earlier, but he wagged his tail proudly as John knelt beside him. You saved her life, buddy, John said, rubbing. his neck. Again. Rain finally began to fall, but no one moved. They stood in the cold, the night around them heavy, but full of quiet relief. The night had finally ended. Ocean View's sky began to peel open in soft amber light, casting golden reflections across the gently lapping waves. The chaos of the previous days had passed like a storm breaking at sea. The city was quieter this morning, as if it too exhaled after holding its breath for too long. John Miller stood alone on the beach, his boots leaving shallow prints in the damp sand. Beside him bounded Shadow, the sable-furred German shepherd now freshly bandaged along the shoulder. The dog moved with a measured energy, slowed only slightly by the scrape of injury. His breath came in puffs as he ran in excited loops, occasionally doubling back to bump his nose against John's thigh. John breathed in the salty air and tilted his head back. The dawn felt heavier than usual, not with burden, but with meaning. Just hours earlier, Vincent Kane and his criminal web had been unraveled. The local precinct buzzed with pride, and headlines were already circulating across news sites. Infamous crime lord captured in heroic police raid. Some of them read. But John didn't care for headlines. He never had. What lingered with him wasn't glory. It was the look on Sophia Turner's face when she had embraced her father. The way Richard, normally composed like a Wall Street statue, had melted in her arms, whispering apologies only a desperate father could summon. Richard Turner had been a distant presence for most of Sophia's life. A titan in the world of global finance, always too busy, always somewhere else. He was a tall man with silvered temples and a crisp demeanor, someone whose voice carried power in boardrooms. Yet in that final moment, standing in the warehouse, trembling after firing a weapon for the first time in decades, he had become simply a father. And Sophia, despite the bruises, despite the trauma, had forgiven him. The morning after their reunion, Richard had held a private press meeting, not to boast about his wealth or business empire, but to publicly thank Officer John Miller and K9 Shadow for saving his daughter. "I owe them my daughter's life," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "They are not just law enforcement. They are the kind of people we build statues for, but never do." He had stepped toward John, and for the first time extended a hand not as a mogul, but as a man who had been humbled. John had simply nodded. Back on the beach now, his thoughts turned to Sophia. She had chosen to stay a few extra days in Ocean View before returning to New York. Her eyes, though no longer fearful, still carried shadows, memories of captivity that would take time to heal. But she smiled now genuinely. That mattered. Earlier that morning, she had stopped by the station with coffee for John and a bag of dog treats for Shadow. Dressed in a white summer cardigan and light blue jeans, her blonde hair loosely tied, Sophia looked far removed from the frightened girl they had pulled from a car trunk. She had grown quickly and painfully, but there was resilience in her now. "I wanted to thank you both," she had said, kneeling to scratch Shadow under the chin. "You didn't just rescue me. You reminded my father that he still had a daughter." John had chuckled, reaching for the coffee. "We're just doing our job." Sophia shook her head. "No, Officer Miller. This was more than a job. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." Shadow gave a low bark, as if to agree, his tail thumping on the floor. That memory warmed John's chest as he gazed across the shoreline. The sun had fully breached the horizon now, bathing the beach in light. A few early joggers passed in the distance, some offering small nods of recognition. But for now, John preferred solitude. It washes way of processing. Reflection, not celebration. Shadow dropped a piece of driftwood at this feat and barked once. John picked it up and hurled it toward the surf. The dog chased after it with joyful speed, his injured leg forgotten in the thrill of the moment. As John watched him, he felt something settle inside him. Something rare for a man who'd spent years dealing with humanity's darkest corners. peace. They hadn't just stopped a criminal. They had mended something broken in a family, and in doing so, perhaps mended something in themselves. The waves curled and crashed, each one a small reminder of time washing forward. Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings or miracles with thunder. Sometimes he sends a loyal dog and a weary police officer on a quiet beach night, just in time to save a soul in need. Shadow didn't just bark at danger, he barked at fate. John didn't just do his duty. He followed a divine whisper that led him straight into a broken story waiting to be rewritten. In our everyday lives, we may never chase criminals or rescue the daughter of a billionaire, but each of us is called quietly, humbly, to notice what others signore, to act when it's easier to look away, to believe that even broken families can be mended. This story reminds us that miracles still walk among us. They come on four legs, in uniforms, in brave hearts that refuse to give up. When love, loyalty, and courage meet, lives are changed and sometimes even saved. So if you believe in second chances, in family bonds that can heal, and in the silent ways God watches over us, comment Amen below to show your faith. Tell us where you're watching from. We want to see how far this story of hope travels. Don't forget subscribe and share this story with someone who believes in miracles. May God bless you and protect every soul who reads this message. Let this story remind you